listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. Responsible Statecraft has a piece entitled, "A U.S. Security Alliance in the Middle East is Unjustified. There is no legitimate case for Washington making new security commitments and assuming additional costs on behalf of Saudi Arabia and Israel." For insight into this, let's turn to my next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow in the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So before we just get into the piece, let me get your take. Now, Joe Biden is on his way. He'll be on his way shortly to Saudi Arabia with hat in hand. This whole idea of a security alliance in the Middle East, as we look at what's happening in Ukraine, as we look at the United States continuing to try to stick its finger in the eye of China, this doesn't look good. Dr. Horne.
Well, you have a point, and I have to say that with regard to the piece by, I recall, Paul Pillar, who was a former CIA leading figure, from the point of view of the hawks in Washington, it was disappointing because, one, U.S. imperialism is trying to broker a so-called security alliance with Saudi Arabia and Israel because that's seen as part of an overall global strategy that has in the crosshairs the People's Republic of China and Russia. You need only look no further than the statement coming out of the NATO meeting just a few days ago in Spain, where it was made clear by the North Atlantic countries joined by Japan and Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, that Russia and China are in the crosshairs. And this is more than a notion. It'll have to be an all-hands-on-deck approach to bringing down both. And certainly Israel has a role to play, not least because it's perceived right now as dangerously close to Russia. It's been accused credibly of leaking sophisticated U.S. military technology to China, and it wields significant influence in U.S. domestic politics. And so that piece in responsible statecraft was rather tone deaf and seemingly oblivious to these political realities. And then with regard to Saudi Arabia, as is well known, the Saudis are major investors in the U.S. economy, not only buying U.S. Treasury bills, which helps to keep the U.S. government afloat, everything from the Pentagon to the post office, but also funneling money to Uber and to Apple and to Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, etc. And so Mr. Pillar should have contemplated that the Saudis and the Israelis are not necessarily going to be standing still as U.S. imperialism pulls the rug out from under them. And with regard to U.S. imperialism, it's apparent that, as Beijing put it, they're trying to kill or harm three birds with one stone. That is to say, to bring down Russia, and in that regard, pay careful and close attention to all of these alarming articles, about, quote, decolonizing, unquote, Russia. That is to say, breaking up Russia seems to be the strategic objective. And I think that listeners should be made aware that this stems from the fact that ever since the Western European nations, led by Britain and France, got fat on the African slave trade and on the depopulation of the Americas, that they had a problem in their backyard with regard to Russia, and that problem is not going away anytime soon. So finally, from their point of view, they're grasping the nettle, and they're determining that Russia has to be broken up, which is obviously more than a notion. It'll require all hands on deck. And with regard to that latter point, You might have noticed all the headlines in the major U.S. press today about how that erstwhile exporting machine, known as the Federal Republic of Germany, is now enduring a trade deficit. That is to say, it's importing more than it's exporting, which is the first time that's happened in 30 years. It obviously has to do with Washington casting that second stone at the European Union, forcing the European Union to break ties with Russian energy and then accept U.S. liquefied natural gas, which will take a while to come online. And then, of course, the third stone is keeping China from flexing its muscles and exhibiting its inexorable rise to being the number one economy on planet Earth. And with regard to Saudi Arabia, Mr. Pillar should explain. If the United States is going to disrupt ties with the Saudis, which I fully understand, in light of U.S. families continuing to protest about Saudi role, real and imagined, in the tragedy of September 11, 2001, well, where will the shortfall in oil be made up if the Saudis continue to be in a de facto alliance with Russia in oil and OPEC plus? I mean, this guy seems to be sort of oblivious to imperialist realities. And then, of course, there's the question with regard to oil. Well, I guess the United States will have to creep closer to Venezuela if they disrupt ties with Saudi Arabia. But how will that play in South Florida? With that reactionary bloc there that seems to hand that Sunshine State on a silver platter to the Republicans every 4 years. And we haven't even talked about the boycott of Iran, another major oil producer, which is being demanded by the Israeli lobby, which, as aforementioned, is too powerful to go up against, at least thus far, given the political realities in the United States of America. So Mr. Pillar needs to explain all that, and he also needs to address Egypt, very close to Saudi Arabia. Keep in mind that just the other day, the Egyptians were beaming and proud as they authorized and set in motion a new light rail transit system from Cairo to their new capital outside of Cairo. Of course, it was built by the People's Republic of China. And we haven't even talked about Saudi's relationship with the People's Republic of China. So that article, it seems to me, has a hash and a jumble of contradictions that the writer, for some reason, did not sort out, and the editor did not force him to do so.
Which is why we always have a disclaimer when we talk about responsible statecraft pieces, is that you have to be very discerning when you read them. What you've just discussed sends me to another space. Let me ask this question. In the policy classes that I taught, I always said to the students that when you're developing policy, you have to always balance the theoretical versus the practical, that a lot of policy that sounds good doesn't always work out as you try to implement it. So as we look at what's now happening to the German economy, as we look at what's happening to France and Macron and the coalition government that he now can't form, as we have people in Poland going through the forest gathering sticks because they're having trouble with energy and they're trying to collect wood. I mean, there are practical realities here that are turning around and biting Joe Biden and his sanctions regime and his weakening Russia idea in the butt. What do you see happening between now and December? It just looks like a Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart.
Well, I think that the North Atlantic countries led by the United States need to adopt and adapt a cultural attribute of Japan. You know that in Japan, when top leaders make blunders, not only do they engage sometimes in a ritualistic apology, sometimes they engage in harikari, that is to say suicide. And given the blunders and the peccadillos and the missteps of U.S. imperialism and its advisors, which obviously underestimated Russia with regard to this conflict with Ukraine, which has set in motion this chain of events that's led to not only Russia and China coming closer together, but strengthening their ties in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, strengthening their ties in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a counterpoint to NATO. You now see Argentina knocking on the door of the BRICS, seeking admission along with Iran. Iran already affiliated with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as is India, which the United States is assiduously courting because of India helping to keep the Russian economy afloat by buying oil on the cheap from Moscow. And all of this was foreseeable.
Right.
I'm sure they must have had a tabletop exercise with regard to this confrontation over Ukraine. They did not apparently contemplate what was inevitable. And as I said, there needs to be some sort of ritualistic suicide by many of the leaders of the North Atlantic Bloc, led by the United States, but don't bet on it, I'm afraid to say, because now they're becoming ever more hysterical. You might have seen the piece from NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which is now warning, one and all, that China's about to take over the moon. I mean, this is going beyond the realm of science fiction, but coming or crashing back to Earth, it's apparent that these so-called geniuses in Washington should have figured out a long time ago that it's going to be more than a notion to borrow from China in order to confront China. And in that regard, keep in mind that In Motion may be one of the biggest heists of all time. Recall that after the Russian intervention in Ukraine, that the United States has frozen $300 billion in Russian assets, and it's unclear what's going to happen. Already, with this new confrontation with China, and China, of course, has lent the United States at least $1 trillion, probably more. Chinese interests own apartment buildings and all manner of facilities, not only in the United States, but in the North Atlantic countries in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So one of the biggest heists of all time might be in motion, which could simultaneously weaken China and strengthen China's antagonists. Now, of course, if I'm aware of this, China's aware of this, and it seems to me that instead of lurching towards ritualistic suicide, it seems to me that the North Atlantic countries led by the United States are trying another manner to reach suicide, which is trying to rip off China by trillions of dollars, which is not the wisest thing to attempt with regard to a nuclear power that simultaneously you're saying is about to take over the moon.
Responsible Statecraft has another piece. Both parties agree on one thing: more money for the military. We have about a minute and a half left. Talk about how tone deaf both sides of the aisle are, and at the same time, Zelensky's asking for $750 billion to rebuild Ukraine.
Well, once again, speaking of blunders, the United States and its North Atlantic allies have not only blundered into adopting the basket case economy that is Ukraine, but rapidly behind Ukraine in that ignominious category is Poland, which you've already suggested is about to endure an energy crunch, which will have many Poles freezing in the dark, not to mention the Baltic republics, led by Lithuania, which is trying to put the squeeze on the Russian city of Kaliningrad, which even has Brussels nervous. So in this so-called Top Gun world, I'm referring to the new Tom Cruise vehicle that's going boffo at the box office, trying to revive the militarism of the 1980s and 2022. But I'm afraid to say that it's too late for Hollywood movies to justify U.S. militarism and imperialism. The United States is obviously behind the 8 ball with few exits that are visible.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that analysis. Looking forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Folks, you've been listening to the Critical Hour here on Radio Sputnik. Thank you for allowing my voice in.